Albertson. Okay. Yeah, today's speaker is Mark Albertson, who will be presenting on George Washington's farewell address. Mark, how are you?
Well, when he stepped away from his desk.
He's still on with us? Yeah, he's still on. I think he might have stepped away.
Let's give him a couple minutes to get, well, we'll give him a lot of minutes to get back.
Yeah, well, we got time, yeah. Okay, Stu, do you want to present Mark?
Sure.
Who needs no presentation.
Yeah. I'll be a guy who needs no, not a lot of words. He's a good friend of ours. He's been here a number of times. For those of you who might be new to this, without going through his whole biography, he's really done a lot of things. He's been an editor, historian, he's an author. He teaches at the Norwalk Community College. Obviously an avid speaker, always extremely interesting. So welcome back, Mark. And today to the group, Mark's going to talk about the George Washington's farewell address. He can tell us everything he knows about it. I understand from him it's extremely interesting topic. So Mark, with that, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me back. This year, actually September is the exact month, but this year marks the 225th anniversary of the farewell address given by the first president of the United States, and that's George Washington. To start with, I don't think Americans understand how blessed they were to have George Washington as their first president. This is all right. He was a big landowner. I'll give you that. He was a slave owner. I'll give you that. The guy who wanted more land is why he was one of those that wanted to throw the crown out of here in the first place. But I think Americans fail to understand that he was not a Julius Caesar. He was not an Oliver Cromwell. He won't be a Napoleon Bonaparte. And he had control of the army and didn't make a grab for the country. I hope people understand how rare that is. That's extremely rare. And when George III was told that George Washington wasn't going to make a grab for the country, his remarks were along the lines, well, if he ever did that, he'd be the greatest human being in the world. Well, that's exactly what he did. He didn't make a grab for the country. It's not what he did. And he will be the president of the Constitutional Convention. He and Ben Franklin, who was older than George Washington, were really the sages here. And really it was Franklin and Washington who tried to ameliorate any disputes during the Constitutional Convention. And there were some ardent debates going on here at the Constitutional Convention. If you ever get a chance to read what these people were discussing, George Washington is the one that said that past politicians, leaders, and diplomats would have almost given their lives to attend this collection of brains and intellects in Philadelphia. Yeah, he's not far off. But Washington was named the president of the convention, and he wants to go home. He wants to go home at this stage. No, you got to stick around. So he becomes president. Now, keep in mind at this stage of the game, parties are being formed, the Federalist and then the Democrat Republicans. The Democrat Republicans were led by Jefferson, and the Federalists, one of the leaders of this party will be Alexander Hamilton. And you are seeing here at the beginning of the country, right at the get-go here, that it's the Jeffersonian notion of the agrarian as the salt of the earth that he feels is the best protector. The person that digs in the dirt is the best protector of limited elective Republican government. Now, this isn't founded as a democracy. I mean, I hear this constantly, and it's nauseating. And the other one was Alexander Hamilton, who saw more towards the industrialization of the country / finance. and it's Hamilton in the end who's going to win. You know, these are the two deciding factors at the beginning of the country, and this is actually what's going to lead to what we call the Civil War. This is what's going to lead to the war. Slavery is important, yeah, I'll give you that, but slavery was the engine of agrarian capitalism below the Mason-Dixon line. That's what slavery was. And of course, that's the engine of the Southern plantations. That's how they maintained economic and political control of the South, and that's what they were interested in. But up north, industrialization will take root. And you're going to find later on, you know, when you go into the Civil War, it becomes America's first industrialized conflict. And it's kind of a mirror what's going to happen in 1914, 1939, and large conventional war. You know, when you have a nation of farmers fighting a nation of wrench turners, guess who's going to win this? The nation of wrench turners is going to win it. And that's what you're going to see. But Washington will be the first president. And, you know, again, he wanted to go home. No, you got to stick around. And even at the end of his second term, I want to go home. No, you got to stick around. But you're talking about a country where the person didn't seek the office sought the man. That's the kind of country it was. Parties at this stage are forming, they're very rudimentary. Then there's two basic parties, Federalist versus Democrat Republican. There are no conventions. There is no campaigning. There's no internet, there's no TV, there's no radio. How are you going to campaign? Well, you could write, you know, there were a lot of people reading the newspapers, the magazines, the almanacs. If you read the after hours debates coming out of the Constitutional Convention, it's priceless. You know, this is an era when people held the English language in high esteem as opposed to what we were reading with these tweets the last 4 years. There's no comparison here. There really isn't. I mean, you know, these guys aren't writing for an 8th grade reading level like they do today. And so George Washington as well, you know, he didn't go to Harvard like John Adams. He didn't go to William and Mary like Thomas Jefferson. And a lot of this is self-educated. Yet, if you read Washington's writings, they're very profound. True, Alexander Hamilton had a hand in the farewell address, but Washington was no chump with the English language. He was almost like Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was not a PhD or he didn't have a master's degree, yet he mastered the English language. I mean, that was one of the assets of Winston Churchill. But George Washington the same way. And so when he leaves office, you know, he spends half his 8 years refereeing his two greatest advisors, Jefferson and Hamilton, because of these two basic notions coming up. And yet he really is, if you want to use the term, the grown-up in the room. He really is. And when you read the farewell address, this is obvious. It's as obvious as it can get. And he's very much for unity, republicanism, very much for the support of government and the unity of the colonies now that are states. He's very much a fan of this. Something that Abraham Lincoln is going to bring out when he gives his inaugural address in 1861, trying to prevent the Southerners from destroying the Union. And he harkens back to this time. And it's interesting, the link between March 4, 1861 and September 17, 1796. You know, Lincoln really reached back. But with George Washington, and he makes certain prognostications here that have come to pass. And I'm just going to read a few passages and analyze them. They're fascinating. Near the beginning, he states, interwoven as is the love of liberty with, get how they know how this is phrased. It's fascinating. Interwoven as is the love of liberty with every ligament of your hearts. Who writes like this anymore? Who writes like Biden? Sure isn't writing like this. No recommendation of mine is necessary to fortify or confirm the attachment. Obviously, he's speaking to the obvious, or he thinks he is. The unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is the main pillar. And he capitalizes the P in the middle of the sentence. So it is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. In other words, what he's telling you, we've put together this republic. You have to love your republic as much as you do your liberty. You can't separate the two. He also was a proponent, keep in mind the country at this point. It was the overriding necessity of this country. I got this when I was in school too. Liberty, freedom, democracy. Yeah, okay, that's bedtime story. Really, it was economic liberty. The idea of owning land. Land is the prerequisite for America, private property. If you own land, you could vote. Remember, if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. That's how it was. Of course, Indians, blacks, and women, forget it. They can't take part anyway. But if you didn't, whites who didn't own land couldn't vote. However, people like Washington, Madison, Jefferson, even Adams up north, if you want to take part, and if you were a poor white in one of the, we didn't have very many cities, in a village, a town, whatever it was, then go 10, 20, 50 miles west, grab 5 acres, 10 acres, 20 acres, 50 acres, and make a go of it. You can vote. You are now part of what I call here the dictatorship of the landed. And that's what this is. Land is the basis of the American Republic. And this is going to form the basis of what? Manifest destiny. And as more people own land, obviously there's more voters, there's more decision makers, but it didn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference whether you had 10,000 acres or 10 acres. You were part of this dictatorship of the landed. Of course, as industrialization takes off and cities begin to appear, urbanization, they're going to have to change that. You can't leave the people in the cities out, if you're going to have voting in the public here. When every part of our country thus feels an immediate and particular interest in union, all the parts combined cannot fail to find in the united mass of means and efforts greater strength, greater resource, proportionally greater security from external danger, a less frequent interruption of their peace by foreign nations. And what is of inestimable value, you must derive from union an exemption from these broils and wars between themselves, which so frequently afflict neighboring countries, and not tied together by the same government. That's important. All the sections of the country are tied together by the same government. There's no competing governments here, which their own rivalships alone would be sufficient to produce, but which opposite foreign alliances, attachments, and intrigues would stimulate and embitter. Now, what he's telling you here is, and again, Lincoln brought this up on March 4, 1861. It doesn't make any difference where you live, north, south, east, west. They all bring, well, the south, the cash crops, the cotton, the rice, the sugar, and of course the tobacco. Up north is beginning to industrialize, small businesses taking off. The eastern seaboard, the growth of ports for import and export. How about the west? You had farmers here, but how about things like skins and furs? And of course, as they take control of the Mississippi River, the resources here. So Washington is saying it makes no difference. North, south, east, west, they all bring their resources, their talents, and their skills to the table to form this union. So what's the problem? That's what Lincoln comes up with later in 1861. Hence, likewise, this is an important one because this is what's happened to the country today. Hence, likewise, they will avoid the necessity of those overgrown military establishments, which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty, which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to Republican liberty. Overbloated militaries. What is it that Dwight Eisenhower said when he left office in 1961? Beware the military-industrial complex, which from where I work is no longer just the military-industrial complex. It is the military-industrial financial security congressional complex. It's the nation's biggest monopoly. And it can't properly explain when they finally do the audit after required by the government in 1990. They did the audit in 2018. They can't properly explain spending $21 trillion in 20 years. So who has power of the purse? The Pentagon or the people you elect? That's where this is going. And so George Washington is warning you about this now. Now, what's fascinating about Washington in 1796 and Eisenhower in 1961, both had been generals, both had been presidents, both had served 2 terms, and you don't think they don't know this? Of course they do. That's why Washington was one of those proponents. We don't want a large standing army, when the country's formed. 13 states, upwards of 4 million people, and you have a regular army of 2,630 men. How are 2,630 men going to guard 13 states? The militia system. Every white male in 13 states, and this is going to go when it's 14, 15, 16, 19, 20, every white male 18 to 45 is part of the militia. And those militias were not controlled by the army or the federal government. They were controlled by the governors. The states applied their own officers. The army didn't do this. It's in the 1792 Militia Act, which bolsters the Second Amendment. That's that amendment that people seem to bellyache about today. But the 1792 Militia Act, if you were a militiaman, you bought your own musket, your own powder, your own ball, your own shirt, your own pants, your own shoes. The government's not going to do it for you. You did it. And on top of that, that legislation passed. It says in the Constitution that the president can go before Congress and ask to federalize the militias. Yes, but for 3 months. And then the president has to go back to Congress and prove he needs them another 3 months because the governors get awful jealous here. So what they did was they spread the risk. What they were putting together and what Washington supported is an army for defense. Americans would surely fight to protect their homes, their towns, and their farms. This is not an army going to the Euphrates River. This is to protect us here at home. That's what it was. So it's fascinating here what he's warning about later on down the road. In this sense, it is your union that ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty. And the love of one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other. In other words, if you like your liberty, you will support this form of government. Now, again, keep in mind, it says Republican liberty. When you say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the democracy for which it stands. When they change that? Read the Constitution. You won't find the word democracy in it once. Read the Bill of Rights. You won't find the word democracy in it once. Go back to the Declaration of Independence. The word democracy does not appear. Does not appear at all. It was founded as a republic. A democracy caters to the mass. It does not cater to the individual. That's a democracy. A republic, as they put together, does cater to the mass, but the 10 Bill of Rights protects your rights from the infringement of government. That's what they wanted. Madison was really the theorist here. Madison stated in Federalist 51, if men were angels, they wouldn't need a government. but men aren't angels, so they need to be governed. But who governs the government? What came first, the chicken or the egg, right? However, who can check the government? The people. The people check the government. But then again, Madison, who checks the people? Hence the electors. Why electors? Because they didn't think you were capable of running a government. That's why they didn't want a democracy. And Washington supports this. In fact, when you had Shays' Rebellion, and he wrote about this, when you had Shays' Rebellion in 1785, you had the people in Eastern Massachusetts who were more financially well endowed, impressing the taxes on the people in Western Massachusetts who were not quite as financially well endowed. And at one point, people in Massachusetts were forking over 1/3 of their income in taxes. Many people were being foreclosed on. So what did they do? Well, you grab a gun. That's what they did. And yet Daniel Shays and 11 others, when it was all over, were sentenced to death. Well, he went up to Vermont. And John Hancock becomes the governor of Massachusetts. And he tells Shays and those 11 others, everything is forgiven, come on home. And Hancock said that maybe instead of relying on draconian penalties, maybe we ought to find out why they revolted. That scared the hell out of some of your founders. That's why they put together what they did in Philadelphia. George Washington, this recent round of unpleasantness in Massachusetts, maybe we ought to find out why. Jefferson, yeah, this recent round of unpleasantness in Massachusetts, maybe we ought to find out why and eliminate the causes. These are guys who are thinking ahead. They're thinking there's no Stalinist approach here. It's forgiven, come on home, and we'll straighten it out. And that's what they're going to do for the most part. And this is what Washington was a fan of. It's fascinating. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations. Again, he highlights the fact, Northern and Southern, Atlantic and Western, it makes no difference. They all bring their resources, skills, and talents to the table. To the efficacy and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. No alliances, however strict, between parts. In other words, alliances between North and West, or Eastern Seaboard and the South, should take effect. That might destroy the union. No, we all elect representatives. We all discuss our problems at the seat of government. That's why we have an elected republic. They must inevitably experience the infractions and interruptions which all alliances in all times have experienced. Sensible of this momentous truth, you have improved upon your first essay by the adoption of the Constitution of Government, which was a more forceful approach to the Articles of Confederation, which is really what it was, which is really what that was. This government, the offspring of our own choice, uninfluenced and unawed, adopted upon full investigation and mature deliberation, completely free in its principles in the distribution of its powers, uniting security with energy and containing within itself a provision for its own amendment, which you can do, has a just claim to your confidence and your support. In other words, this republic that they built is for everybody. But again, in particular, at this stage of the game, for landowners. Why? Because the country was founded on economic liberty. Many of your founders believed that economic liberty will reinforce civil rights, human rights, the right of the individual. Why? Because they own land. Land has always been a determinant of power. They weren't stupid. They knew this. In fact, they consulted, your founders are amazing. They consulted the failure of Athenian democracy. They consulted the failure of Rome. They consulted writings such as Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan. Hobbes once wrote in this book. I've got this book. It's interesting read. It's a thick book, but it's interesting. That an authoritarian or dictatorship, an authoritarian style of government or dictatorship is better than no government. That's not what your founders want to put together here. That's not what they want. They went more with what John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu. You have a triad of government, and this triad of government, one offsets the other, so not one dominates. John Locke, though, was the one who thought and this is how he worded this, the legislative branch should be more equal than the other two. Why? Because they're elected by the people. Interesting perspective here, going back to the 17th and 18th centuries. Fascinating what you're seeing develop here and how your founders grab this and move on. But at the same time, after this, really, in fact, at this point, 1796, Gouverneur Morris, who was one of the founders, he was at the Constitutional Convention, had been assigned to France between 1791 and 1795. And he wrote back because he was watching the French Revolution. He prophesied in 1793, 1794, warning the founders that this revolution, unlike ours, is going to degenerate into a dictatorship. And what happened? Napoleon. He was right. He was right, which is why some of your founders felt vindicated that they didn't try to make this a democracy. They thought democracy degenerated into Napoleon. They were convinced of this. They were also convinced, some of them were, well, let's get rid of the electors. No, we're not, because the common man can't run a country. He's not equipped for it. He's not informed enough, and he's not educated enough to run a country. How do you like that slap in the face? Interesting, isn't it? From some of your founders. You know what Roger Sherman from Connecticut said at the Constitutional Convention? We ought to leave the people with as little to do in government as possible. Wow. Nice, they like the common man here. Respect for its authorities, that is the government. Respect for its authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures are duties enjoined by the fundamental maxim of true liberty. Not only the liberty of the state, but the liberty of the individual. Now, I like to call your founders enlightened authoritarians because that's what they were. They didn't trust the common man. Yet at the same time, and they were concerned with this, and Washington was as well, this idea of religion. You know why George Washington went to church? Because Martha said it would look good to the mass. That's why he went to church. Many of your founders were deists. They believed in a higher power. They believed in God. They used the term creator a lot. They believed in this, but organized religion? One of the real hardcore anti-religionists was Thomas Paine, who really, when he was, I got a volume of his writings, and he gets into this thing of anti-Christianity. He really cut Christianity on another navel. He really did. Maybe that's why only 8 people showed up to his funeral. I don't know. Anyway. So you have to give these guys credit putting this together. They're consulting a wide variety of venues. And this is getting down to that downside of the age of reason, age of enlightenment. But at the same time, and Washington's part of this, you are seeing the beginning of the end of monarchy-dominated governments. Understand something about Washington and this group. Most countries are still run in a monarchical fashion, royalty, nobility. But this is now beginning that stretch run to 1918 when the whole thing falls apart. But they're considered radicals. They're running against the tide, but they're helping to establish a new tide, which makes them dynamic. They're really radical. Then fast forward to 1917. You don't think Lenin was not considered radical? He's running against the established tide here. A worker's paradise, which is not going to be, but you get the general picture. He's running against establishment. That's what you're seeing here. So your founders were running against what was accepted. And now it's going to become more prevalent as the years go on. This suborning of royalty. It's fascinating to see. Absolutely fascinating to see. All obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or all the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of the party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternate triumphs of deliberate parties, to make public administration the mirror of all the ill-concerted, incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils, modified by mutual interest. He's warning about the party. He says parties breed factionalism. And he says you will always find in a party someone who will opt to abide by the precepts of the party as opposed to the precepts of the nation. You don't see that now with some of these half-brained Democrats and Republicans? You don't see this now? If you don't see it now, you're blind. It's happening right before your eyes. It's happening right before your eyes. He warns about this. And yet at the same time here, you are seeing parties being formed. Democrat, Republican, Federalist. In fact, what happened in 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts, during the John Adams years, so they passed this Alien and Sedition Acts because they were afraid Democrat Republicans were in favor of admitting French, trying to get away from the French Revolution, and were siding with the French. So what did they try to do? They try to cut down on Democrat Republicans trying to publish in newspapers, magazines, and almanacs. That's an affront to the First Amendment. You're seeing this in the beginning of the country. It's fascinating what you're seeing here. It truly is. But that's what he warned about. Parties breed factionalism. And you will always find in any party somebody who will abide by the party before he abides by the nation. And that's true. If you remember the Nazis, if you remember the fascists, if you remember so on and so forth. It's fascinating what you see when you really begin to look here. And that's another thing Lincoln brought up, the idea of unity. It's all part of it here. He also adds to this, it serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community, get this, with the ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. You don't think that's not happening today? Where people aren't paying attention to taxes, Iraq, so on and so forth. No, they're paying attention to whatever noise is coming out of these two parties, which serves not to run the country at all. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another. Democrats and Republicans are equally guilty of this with gerrymandering. They have reinforced the division in this country with gerrymandering over the decades. Nice that they sleep nights. Foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the party and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Well, Israel and Saudi Arabia are examples of that. They are. Can't deny it. And so what he's trying to do here is foster patriotism. If you love your unity, if you love this country, you will love your government. Why? Because you can't have one without the other. and entangling alliances for George Washington, which he warned against, are not business deals. They're not accords of trade with other governments. You know, many of your founders were fans of commerce. Why do we need large navies for? Let's build transports instead. You have something I want, I have something you want. Why don't we trade? Yeah, how's that worked out? Not too well. Not too well. But that was some of what your founders thought. I think at heart they were part capitalist, which is fine. You know, which is fine. But they didn't want a large standing army. They didn't want a large, you know, Jefferson comes to mind here. When he was president for 2 terms, Jefferson was a cheapskate. He didn't mind spending $10,000 on a gunboat, but he wouldn't spend $300,000 on a frigate. And he was pushed. Why don't you build a few more frigates? No, we don't need those. We don't need those. Yet when the War of 1812 came along, there were some people here who thought they wished they did have another half a dozen frigates against the British Navy. Well, that was Jefferson. He was cheap. But the fact of the matter is, Washington is a big proponent of limited Republican government, not a fan of parties, not a fan of a large military. The civilians, the governors can handle this unless we need to federalize the militias. He's also, by the way, a big proponent of unity. It makes no difference. And also people owning land. John Adams bolsters him here. John Adams once made the remark, and he wasn't a Southern plantation owner, but he once made the remark that for a functioning system of representative government, the wide ownership of land was required. The more people who own land, the more people will be concerned with how their country's being run. Now, it's no secret here that land, ever since man grabbed the first piece of land, land has been a determinant of power. And your founders understood the more land that is in too few hands, what do you think eventually happens here? What do you think happened here? They didn't want to be controlled by the crown. What do you think happened in France? Too much land and control. In fact, out of the entire country of France, 3% of the population controlled 20% of the land. And even the Catholic Church, which your founders understood, even the bishops in France were still charging people who own their own land tithes, fees, and duties so they could pad their pockets. The Catholic Church. That led to the de-Christianization effort in France with Robespierre. That's not what they wanted here. You know, you're really blessed that what happened in France did not happen here. I mean, of course, one thing is, and again, your founders understood this, and George Washington is one of them. We skipped a decided stage toward revolution. And that was feudalism/serfdom. Even though serfdom is over in France and the peasants own their land, there was still that restricted clique of nobles who were still charging peasants fees and duties and taxes left over from feudal times. That didn't happen here. Many of the whites who came here from the beginning got land, indentured servants. Maybe once they worked off their debts, were able to save a little money, get land themselves. We skipped that feudalism serfdom. And so when you get to the revolution, more of the people are on board together. It's fascinating. We didn't have this factionalism that you saw in France. We missed it. And so it's interesting what happened here as opposed to what happened in France. And again, Russia, 1917, land, Vietnam, land, China. You know, it's no accident that many of the peasants in China went with Mao instead of Chiang Kai-shek. Why? Mao gave them the land. Kim Il-sung in North Korea gave them the land. Heck, even Castro made sure the peasant got the land in Cuba. It's fascinating what we kind of miss here. But your founders, again, understood the importance of land, and that's George Washington. Of course, like I said, he's a big landowner and wanted more, but they're willing to share. What a country. What a country. It's fascinating. Consolidation of power in government. It is important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country, an important one, free thinking, critical thinking among the population, right? Or else you think it's going to work? It is important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration. In other words, your elected officials, to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres. In other words, we don't want anybody elected or assigned to do this, trying to do A, trying to do B or C or even D. That leads to a consolidation of power. You want this fractionalization in government. You want these people doing what they were elected or assigned to do. You don't want them overstepping authority. That's what he's warning about. That's what he's warning about. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments in one, and thus to create whatever form of government a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart. Again, go back to Madison. If men were angels, you wouldn't need a government, but men aren't angels, so they need to be governed. It's fascinating here how many of them are on the same page here. The necessity of reciprocal checks in the exercise of political power by dividing and distributing it into different depositories and constituting each guardian of the public weal against invasion by the others has evinced by experiments, ancient and modern, some of them in our country and under our own eyes. To preserve them must be necessary as to institute them. If the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way in which the Constitution designates. In other words, rule of law. Rule of law. Of course, we can add to this what Jefferson wrote in a letter, and I bring this letter up a lot. He wrote a letter in 1816 to a Samuel Kercheval. In this letter, and I think without professing same, I think Jefferson is admitting the founders made a mistake. He's saying to Samuel Kercheval, and he said, this ought to be in the Constitution, that every 19 or 20 years, each generation should have a constitutional convention to acclimate the documents to the present generation. We've never done that. We've applied amendments along the way, but we've never done this. God forbid we have a convention now. Good Lord Almighty. But he's saying this should be in the Constitution because, as Jefferson noted in the same letter, the present belongs to the living and not the dead. It's common sense, right? Present belongs to the living, not the, and he even says, what are the dead? The dead are nothing. They're nothing. Not being stupid, he understood that the country in 1787 is not going to be the same country in 1857. This is not hard to figure out. Number one, there's going to be more people, more wants, needs, desires. So you got to change. I think the founders made one more mistake. I think what they should have done is installed in our government, in our blueprint for government, the Constitution, a mechanism for applying elected officials to federal government. Now we're left with Democrats and Republicans doing it, and they're about as worthwhile. You know, they screw up a free lunch, many of these people. The importance of religion. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, get that one. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of man and citizen. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in the exclusion of religious principle. He admits religion can bring principle to a people. He admits this, but there's always the dark side where people will use religion to keep the people in line. Or as Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, religion is the opiate of the masses. And to a certain extent, he's right. Religion has been used since it's been started to keep the mass in line. And so it's fascinating here, this tug of war that's been going on for centuries, and how Washington sees this, but to preserve the nation. That's what he's looking to do. And one more thing about Washington here. He served 2 terms, didn't want to serve a second term, wanted to go home. No, you got to stick around. So he does. But in 1796, I'm leaving, I'm going home. And that's what he's going to do. And we don't need a law. We don't need an amendment. We don't need a resolution passed by Congress. Every president who follows through the 19th century into the 20th, every president who follows, who gets a second term, automatically steps down and goes home. That's American exceptionalism, not this crass consumerism we got today. That's American exceptionalism. How many other countries did that happen in? Where the person who got a second term followed Washington, that's the path. They followed Washington and went home. Woodrow Wilson wanted a third term in 1919, but he's not going to get it. He died. It's a good way you're not getting a third term. In fact, that's the same. I've given talks in the 1920 presidential election, and it's a fascinating election. And the Republicans wanted to bring up Teddy Roosevelt again. He died. So now the Democrats have to go with James Cox, and the Republicans will go with Warren G. Harding. That's interesting. Wilson wanted a third term. The Republicans wanted to bring back Teddy Roosevelt, and they both died. Now we're going back to the drawing board. But many of these people, many of these men who got elected for a second term followed Washington's example and voluntarily went back home or whatever they were doing prior to being in office. What a country. I mean, that's really the essence of what the peaceful transfer of power. And then, of course, after Roosevelt got elected for a fourth term, what did Congress do? We better nip this in the bud now before it gets out of control. And that's what they are going to do. You can't serve no more than 2 terms and you're out. Anyway, I could go on with this for a week, but, anybody have any questions or comments on Washington's address or on Washington himself? Or it's fascinating what really went on here in 1796. Truly is.
Thanks, Mark. Wow, that was fascinating. I see we have one question. Let me ask, I'm just curious. When Washington is giving this address, he's in Philadelphia, right? And
Right.
Who exactly is he talking to?
He's talking to Congress, but obviously this is going to get into the newspapers and so on and so forth. And keep in mind again, there's no television, radio. We don't have any of that. And
Well,
it's going to take a while for it to filter out.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious. He's talking to these people. Do they really understand? I mean, the language is kind of complex when you read it. Are they really understanding it while he's talking?
Oh yeah,
they do.
Yeah, in America at one point, with a country of about 4 million people, we had 3 or 4 times as many newspapers as France, a country with 26 million people. That's astounding. And then you have people like, to add to this, Washington and Jefferson were firm believers in the Postal Service. The Postal Service should deliver newspapers to every household in the country for free, because Jefferson thought the people needed to be informed.
Wow, what a concept.
Yeah, yeah. As opposed to what you get now.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's what they believed in. You know, they didn't trust the common man to rule, but you can't do without the common man if you want this to last. That's the dichotomy here. That's the tug of war. We don't want them to rule, but we need to allow them to take part. And Jefferson thought that the best how they can take part is if you educate them. In fact, Jefferson stated, he wrote, and in fact, I've got a book on Jefferson's writings too. He wrote that before you start educating young children in religion, which they're not going to get, why don't you educate them in English history, American history, of course, go back to the time, Greek classics, Roman classics, science, literature. Let's do this before religion. That was Jefferson.
Wow.
So it's interesting here how he thought, and then with Washington too, how you educate the population. They wanted this to last, in other words. That's what they wanted.
Good idea. Anyway, so guys, raise your hands. You have a question. No statements, just questions. Second question, go to the end of the line. So Arcady, you're first.
Okay.
Yeah, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. That's a great presentation you gave. Really appreciate it.
Thank you
I
very
have a
much.
question along the topic or line of your presentation, but more related to current events. As you know now, cancel culture, woke culture is pushing ahead, and which present the United States as inherently racist country. So my question is, who pushed this ideology, which really harmful for the country? Who drives that?
Well, it's been we've been a racist country since 1619.
Yeah,
know,
that's what they say.
Yeah, and we've never gotten over it. And even at the Constitutional Convention, to make sure that the Northerners and Southerners got together here, slavery, all right? The Southerners are very much concerned. There's more people up north than there are down south. So if we're going to put together this government, especially like the legislative branch, each state gets 2 senators, but not all these states are cookie cutter. You're going to have a different amount of representatives in the House of Representatives. So the Northerners were conceded to the South. Okay, you can count 2/3 or you can count 3/5 of your slaves toward representation in Congress. That's the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution. This virtually has relegated this is one of the things that relegated blacks to second class status. They still are. They still are. In fact, in fact, I've been doing for the last 5 years, I've been going to some of these groups on their sites, Daily Stormer, Patriot Front, the 3 Percenters, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers. I've been doing this for 5 years. And then I've been going to the other side. I've been going to Workers' World, they're young communists. I've been going to the Nebo Proctor Library, they're Marxists in Oakland. I've been going to the World Socialist website, who are communists from the Trotskyite variety. And so if you go to these different persuasions like I've been doing, you get a picture of how they view these things that you're asking. Now, when you go to the extreme right, what are you saying? Well, blacks are second-class citizens. We don't like Jewish people. We don't like Latinos. We don't like Muslims. We don't even like our own mothers. Yet at the same time, you go to some of the left, and they're discussing about how the Israelis are oppressing the Palestinians, how the police here are beating up the blacks. And so when I go to these different sites, I get a cross section, and I even get involved in the conversation. I did this last Sunday with a communist in Oakland on democratic socialism. That was a fun 2-hour chat. And so, but it's fun to do. And so when you go to these different persuasions that the newspapers cover, especially the extreme right, what happened on January 6th, then you begin to get a picture when you talk to some of these people yourself. In fact, so this idea of racism, it's not gone away. It's something that's been here. is here and is going to be here for a long time. In fact, I just got done reading a book called The Passing of the Great Race. The book is written by Madison Grant. This book was written in 1916, and this book is going to have an effect on the 1922 legislation passed in Congress and the subsidiary legislation passed in 1924, the Johnson Act, limiting, we don't mind Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, Germans, French, Brits coming here, but we don't want Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Eastern Central Europeans. Why are they going to bring Catholicism and God forbid Marxism and socialism? But we don't mind Northern Europeans coming here, because in this book, it extols the virtue of what? The Nordic race. So it's fascinating how this has always been with us. And I'll tell you right now, it's not going away. It's just not. It's that stain in the American shirt that no detergent of goodness has yet gotten out. It hasn't. But then again, isn't that the human condition? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's part of the human condition. It seems to be. You can find it in every country. We don't just do this ourselves. You can find it in every country. But you would think with what the founders put together, even though preserving slavery, that, you know, when you're writing things like consent to the governed, economic liberty, the freedom of the individual, you would think that this would overcome things such as slavery, exclusivity, things of this nature. Yet it really in the end doesn't make any difference, whether it's a republic, a democracy, socialism, Marxism. If the people don't take part, guess what happens? Falls apart. Then we begin the process all over again. Let's rip it apart and start from scratch. You know, so man's on the wheel, on the rat wheel. It's always been that way. And I don't expect it to change anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. Wow.
Because if it does, I'm out of a job. Anybody else have any questions or-
Bob Rosenthal.
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Hi, this question overlaps what Arcadia just asked, but this new critical race theory that's out there sort of states that the whole founding of the United States is invalid because of the inherent classism and racism of people like Jefferson and Washington and the rest of them who did not trust ordinary Americans. As you pointed out, they didn't believe in democracy. And they're using this fact to basically say that our entire system of government is invalid. I wonder, could comment on that.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, the idea, you know, again, you're coming out of an era, well, you're still in the era of authoritarian rule. I mean, you had in the English Revolution this notion of suborning the powers of the king and give more power to Parliament. And yet that country will fall prey to Oliver Cromwell. And your founders consulted this and understood, you know, Jefferson once remarked too, it doesn't make any difference if you have a dictatorship based on one person or a dictatorship based on a parliament or a Congress with 149 people who lord over the mass. A dictatorship is a dictatorship. He's referencing what happened in Greece. Now you had Athens, which had about 250,000 people, and really 6,000 people run it. Well, what happened to this democracy? It doesn't really exist. And so there's always been that struggle between representative government and authoritarian government. But then just how representative is representative government? Doesn't a lot of that fall on the people themselves? There is some truth to what you're saying here, because look how we spread across this great land. We took the land from the Indian, but isn't that what the human condition does? Isn't that what it does? Of course it does. Yet the fascinating aspect of American imperialism is common people like yourselves were grabbing land because they wanted to chart their own destiny. That's the fascinating aspect of American imperialism in the 19th century. People like us. Well, I got to get out of here. I'm going to grab 20 or 50 acres and make a go of it. And they do. And it's fascinating. It's the businessmen, the banker that follow. Huh. The railroads follow. The telegraph follows. It's the common everyday Joe for the most part that leads this. And does this further lead to inequality? Yeah. How'd they treat the Indian? How'd they treat the Indian? And so that racism or exclusivity, you know, this nice republic they're trying to put together, yet we're still eliciting the failures of the human condition. I mean, you know, you don't think, let's turn it around. You don't think if Palestinians had the upper hand, Israelis would be having a real problem here? I've brought that up in some discussions and I get some dirty looks. I said, well, the human condition is the human condition. You know, so it's, or, you know, if the Indians had gotten together and killed all the whites, they would have preserved their land for their way of life. That doesn't happen. This happened for a reason, but the basic premise of what they put together is a pretty good scheme, despite its faults, as Ben Franklin said. I agree to this Constitution with all its faults. Now, Franklin has the last word here. Franklin has the last word. He says, he was asked that the last day of the Constitutional Convention, he's 81 years old. What do you think? Well, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such. And he says, I agree that we need a government. And I agree that this government will be run well administered well over a course of years. When it will when it will eventually fall into despotism, you know why? He says, because the people will be capable of nothing but despotism. What's part of that? Racism, maybe? So we can't, as a species, seem to break this cycle. And so, yes, there is truth to what they're saying about Jefferson was a slave owner. Jefferson was a large landowner. So was Andy Jackson later on. So was Madison. You know, that's part of what's coming out of this. That's true. But when you read what they're putting together, you can't deny that this is something to really look at. I mean, really. And so, you know, you have this style of government, which the Constitution is really to govern the government, and then the Bill of Rights to protect you from the infringements of government. I mean, no one else was doing this. Not really. Makes them unique. But they do have their faults. I'll give you that.
So how would those guys view the Electoral College these days? How would they view that?
Maybe not too well, because the way they originally wanted it structured. In fact, Alexander Hamilton wrote this in the Federalist, that, you know, it says in the Constitution said the state has to have electors. Okay, but it's up to the state how they choose the electors. He thought, how about the voters choosing the electors? That's not happening anymore. The Democrats and Republicans pick them. You honestly think Democrats and Republicans are going to pick people that are going to act as a check on them? They're going to pick party hacks. That's what they're going. So the system got prostituted. It's one of the reasons it doesn't work. It's one of the reasons it doesn't work, which is why I go back to what I mentioned earlier. If we had a nomination process as well in the Constitution, maybe parties wouldn't have gotten that task or job of bringing up the people. In other words, what I'm telling you here is you elect people already selected for you.
Yep.
I don't call that very representative.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Going once.
I think Joe had one, I think.
I thought, but I asked him, he said he didn't come back.
Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah, I was muted. Taking a look, if the founders wanted the people that supported the government to have a say in who got elected and who ran the government, it's one thing, but today it seems that the people that are not supporting the government, that is paying taxes or whatnot, referring to the landowner, have more say in government and what's happening than the people that are supporting it. Is this something that maybe they foresaw that
Yeah. Jefferson, Madison wrote that money would be what control of money would be what would kill the country. That's why Congress should have power of the purse. And so in 1990, when they passed the Chief Financial Officers Act, by which every major branch of the government, every CFO of every major branch of the government was supposed to do an audit and turn it into Congress. Congress is supposed to have power of the purse. Now, this is signed off on by George Bush Sr. He was president. That makes it law. Yet who doesn't do the audit for 28 years? The Pentagon. They don't do the audit for 28 years. When they finally do the audit with 1,200 accountants looking at the books, they can't, between 1998 and 2018, they can't properly explain spending $21 trillion. Now, I read the letter of Ernst & Young. Remember, that accounting firm? Now, that's not a neighborhood accounting firm. That's a nationwide accounting firm. They were one of the ones picked to audit the books. And they said in that letter, it's nearly impossible to come to a result with the way the Pentagon's been moving the money over the years. That accounts for the $400 hammers and the $500 toilet seats. And so the Pentagon is one big shell game. That's what it is. That's not a slight against the privates, the corporals, and the sergeants. They're the blue collar guys in the military. I know because I talk to a lot of them. They're the blue collar guys. I'm talking about the generals and so on and so forth. Some of these guys, they get a nice big pension from you, and then they go wind up working for Raytheon, Boeing, Sikorsky. So the next time you're watching Fox or CNN, and they've got Colonel or General so-and-so talking about Syria or Afghanistan, and he says, we got a lot of cruise missiles, fine, get the guy's name, look him up. Maybe he's working for Raytheon. So it's interesting where this has gone, because of money. So you have to ask the question, who really has power of the purse? The people you've elected or the people who you haven't elected? It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yep. Doesn't look like we have any more questions, Mark. So again, thank you very much for exciting, interesting, fascinating talk about Washington, excuse me, and Jefferson and the rest of them.
And now that I ruined your afternoon.
Some things to think about. But again, we appreciate you being here on behalf of the Senior Men's Association, and we hope to see you again. And I'll switch it back to Joe.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mark. As always, it's been a great pleasure having you with us. And with that, I want to wish everybody have a good week and stay safe, stay well, and we'll hope to see you all next Thursday.
And have
Try
a
and bring
great
in new
day.
members, guys.
Take care now. Stay well.
Thank you, Mark.
You too.